everybody. We're ready to make some sourdough. Beeble has risen indeed. My sourdough starter is nice and bubbly. When I first mixed it up, it was like to here. And so it's more than doubled. It's good and bubbly and active. And we're going to make some dough. It is just before bedtime. I'm going to let it rise overnight and bake it off in the morning. So the first thing, I'm using a recipe by Clever Carrot, and I love all of her sourdough resources, and I'll put a link up because she's awesome, and I've learned almost everything from her. So this is her beginner's guide to sourdough recipe with a couple little tweaks. And it's done in grams. I'm using a kitchen scale. I will put volume measurements up there. If you do get into baking, kitchen scales are amazing. But they're totally not required if you're new to baking and just want to get yourself started. So I'm going to start out by adding my sourdough starter. This is really good bubbly active starter. You want to make sure your starter is active before you put it in a bread dough, or it won't rise within the time you think it's going to. So I'm looking for about 150 grams. And to that, I'm going to add 250 grams of water. The recipe says warm. I don't bother with the difference. The important thing is that if you live in town and your water is heavily chlorinated, you probably want to use filtered water or bottled water. Actually, I added a little too much there as I was talking. So we're just going to dip some of that out. That's about right. Okay, because the chlorine in tap water can kill some of the yeast. So you want to be using water that's not heavily chlorinated for anything involving sourdough baking. 25 grams of olive oil. Alright. And then I'm going to grab a whisk and I'm going to whisk this all together until we have a nice little slurry. And it doesn't have to be perfect, just enough to be mostly incorporated. Alright, and now I'm going to put it back on my scale, zero that out, and add my flour and my salt. I'm using 500 grams of flour. The recipe calls for bread flour, and that would definitely give you like the nicest, chewiest bread. But all I have right now is all-purpose, and it's going to work just fine. So if that's all you've got, don't worry about it. And for 500 grams here, oh, come on now. That's what I get for talking and measuring. There we go. All right. Then I'm going to add my salt. The recipe calls for 10 grams, and I don't think that's quite enough, but maybe I like my things saltier. I add about 13. Almost there. There we go. All right, and this is essentially a no-knead recipe, which is wonderful. You get enough gluten development just by letting this dough rise overnight, or just by letting it sit overnight and kind of develop, and then by shaping the bread as well, that you still get a nice chewy crumb. Probably even better if you use bread flour. Now this recipe is designed for all-purpose flour. I do make my sourdough starter with whole wheat because I like the flavor that contributes to the starter. I think it makes for a more, I don't know, a stronger tasting sourdough. But I wouldn't sub whole wheat for white flour in this recipe. The amount of moisture it needs is different. The gluten levels are different. There's a lot of stuff that's different. If you want to make a whole wheat sourdough and you've never made sourdough before, I recommend maybe making this a few times, this particular recipe a few times, and then looking up some more information online on how to do a whole wheat sourdough, because it's going to be totally different. But what I'm doing right here is I'm just kneading it enough that it starts to collect all of the flour that's in the bowl. So this is a fairly firm dough, and what it's going to give you is a bread that's pretty close textured. There's not going to be a ton of huge air bubbles in it. They're going to be more small and spread out. It shouldn't be a heavy loaf. It should just be more of a sandwich bread loaf than like an artisan bread loaf, like with the smaller bubbles. So I'm just going to keep kneading this, and it's almost there. I just want it to collect all of the extra flour from this bowl, and then when it starts to get really nice and smooth all over, and you can feel it's like it's not dusty on any part of it, then you know you've got it kneaded enough. So we're really just trying to incorporate this all the way. I guess it's not truly a no-knead bread. But we're just about there. It's feeling gently sticky all over. It's feeling nice and uniform, feeling pretty smooth. So now I'm just going to flip it over, kind of put that smooth side up, get it a little uniform, and I'm just going to cover it with a damp cloth. Leave it at room temperature overnight. Her recipe has you do more things to it. I have no doubt they make a better sourdough loaf than the one I'm making, but the one I'm making is pretty darn good, and I get to do it up at night and go to bed and make it in the morning. So I like that. So I will see you in the morning, and we'll talk through turning that dough into a loaf of bread. Alright, it's first thing in the morning, and we're going to check on this. You can see it's risen, maybe it's like 1.5 its volume, which is fine. A lot of bread recipes, the default thing they'll tell you is to wait until it's doubled in volume. And that's more important for the second rise. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But for your first rise, you really just want to make sure your yeast is alive and multiplying in your dough and creating some air bubbles. So that's happened. So 1.5 the volume is fine. So now we're going to take this out of the bowl and shape a loaf. I'm going to put some flour down on the counter. You want to be kind of generous here. Okay, so I'm going to squish out some of the air bubbles that have been formed. You don't have to do this. If you wanted like an artisan loaf with some big bubbles inside, it would not be a great idea to smush on your dough right now. But I want a pretty consistent tight crumb, like you would want for a sandwich. So I squished a little bit, and then I'm going to place my dough right here on this flour. And this is the part that intimidates people, but it's really not that hard. Hopefully the video will help. But I'm just going to start folding the bottom up and in, giving it a twist. Okay, and I'm just going to bring all the sides into the middle like this. And what this is doing is this is stretching the ball of dough so that it kind of forms a skin on the outside. That's what helps the crust be nice and uniform and crisp. So you just want to tighten the skin on the outside, and then you can bring all the points kind of together in the middle and squish them a little bit. And then what I do is I flip it over, take off some of the extra flour, put it on a part of the countertop that doesn't have flour, because now I want it to stick. And then I'm going to tuck my hands under while rotating. So rotate maybe a quarter turn and just keep tucking my hands under. And the friction of that dough against the countertop, it's going to catch, and it's going to kind of twist and continue to tighten that skin. So I'm going to do this just a little bit to tighten up the skin. And you can see it's forming itself more into almost a ball than into like a flat disc. and you can see the skin is getting tighter and smoother. And I'm almost done here. You don't want to do this so long that the skin gets so tight that it rips. That is not what you're looking for. So I'm going to do that. And then that's pretty good. And I'm going to put some cornmeal onto a pan. It's nice to bake this in a cast iron pan. It'll help your crust get extra nice and crispy. It is not required. You can use a normal baking sheet. The cornmeal is there to help keep the bread from sticking. And if you want, you can use flour. You may need to brush it off once you pull it out of the oven because it'll be a little dusty on the bottom. But flour definitely works in a pinch. I want to show you something real quick here. I don't know if you can see, if I put this in shadow, you see those few little holes right there? That's where I got the skin a little too tight and it started pulling away and ripping on itself, which doesn't really hurt your bread. But if you look for that, that's a sign that you're over tightening your skin. So I'll just put that in there. And then we're going to let this rest, again, in a warmish place if you can. It'll rise at room temperature. It'll just rise a little slower. And we're waiting for it to become about doubled in volume. And this time we really do want it doubled in volume because your second rise determines how nice and fluffy your bread is going to be when it bakes. So if you don't do your second rise fully, you'll get bread that's denser than it should be. So a lot of recipes will give you a time guideline. That's kind of helpful, but it varies so much depending on the activity of your yeast and the temperature of your room, that really what you want to look for is you want to look for this doubling in volume. And also, when it's fully risen, if you push your finger into it gently, it should leave an indent that doesn't spring back. Watch how this springs back. So when it's fully risen, the indent shouldn't spring back like that. So we're just going to let this be. I expect I will be able to bake this off a little before lunchtime, and it's about 8 o'clock right now. So that gives you a rough time scheme. And my kitchen is not all that warm right now.
Does your cover need to be damp?
Your cover does need to be damp. Thank you. Yes. And that will prevent like a hard skin from forming on top of the bread. You want the dough to stay nice and moist. So we'll check in with this when it's time to bake it. Okay, so we should be ready to go in the oven. Take a look at this loaf. It's, I'd say that's probably not quite double from where it was, but it looks pretty good to me. So even if it's just maybe 1.5, it's going to be, I'm going to dip my finger in water so my finger doesn't stick to the dough. But if you see that indent it's filling in a little bit, but it's still remaining pretty indented in there. You could let this keep going until it got maybe like, I don't know, 30% bigger. So actually double the original size. But I'm going to stick it in the oven because I need this loaf to be done in time for dinner, and that's what's going to happen. So there's some flexibility with bread, is kind of what I want to say. Before I stick it in the oven, there's 2 things that need to happen. First is I'm going to make a slash about a 1/2 inch deep, just like this. You could slash your bread in another pattern if you want. You could make, a couple parallel slashes, whatever. The idea is to give the bread room to rise more in the oven. You've got all these little air bubbles now from the yeast, and when you put it in the oven, the air in those bubbles is going to heat up, and they're going to expand, and the bread is going to rise more. So you want to give it room to expand in a specific direction. And if you don't slash your bread won't be ruined, but it'll make its own place to expand. It'll burst its own hole and shoot a weird bulbous growth of bread out of one spot because you didn't give it room to expand. So it looks a lot nicer if you slash it. The second thing I'm going to show you before I put my bread in, I have a tray that lives in the bottom of my oven and just lives in there so I can pour water in it. And that helps recreate the steam environment of commercial bread ovens. It'll help the bread to rise better in the oven because the steam will keep this outer crust moist longer, so it'll be pliable longer, so the bread can rise up more. It'll also help develop that nice, like, shiny, crispy crust that you get on artisan bread. And so I have a pan in the bottom of my oven, and when I put the bread in, I'm going to pour in 1 cup of water. Some people pour in hot water, some people pour in cold water, some people pour in ice cubes. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. So I'm going to pour in some cold water, because that's what I got. And we're going to put this in the oven. It's preheated to 450. As soon as I put it in, I'm actually going to drop it down to 400, and I'm going to break it. I'm going to bake it for probably an hour, but I'll check it at 50 minutes. And probably about halfway through, or at some point in there, I'm going to just rotate my pan 180 degrees just to make sure that it's baking evenly on both sides. And that's about it. I'll check in when the bread is done, or when it's close to done. I just realized my oven rack is in the wrong place. You want your oven rack around the middle, toward the middle bottom of your oven. So kind of like that. I'll put the bread in, and then I'm going to take my water, and this is going to steam. So I'm going to do that fast and shut the door. And then I'll turn my temperature down, set my timer for 50 minutes, and I will check back in when I check on the bread at 50 minutes. So it's been 50 minutes, and I'm going to open the oven and take a peek, but I think it's going to need a few more minutes. I'll stand back so I don't get steamed here. Okay, so that's getting close, but I'm going to give that at least 5 more minutes. Okay, I think it's time to take my bread out. It's been in there for the full 60 minutes. Let's see, it's pretty steamy. There we go. And it's looking a little yellow because of the lighting. I wonder if I can turn that off and show the color better. There we go. That looks right. So yeah, that's a pretty good golden brown color. I like that. I'm going to remove it from the pan and set it on this rack once I have 2 hands to do it with. And then ideally you want to let it cool down to room temperature before you cut it. Otherwise the inside can kind of get gummy. And even though hot bread is nice, like, yeah, the texture will be better if you let it cool. So what I typically do with a loaf of bread this size is I will slice it directly in half when I'm ready to use it, and I'll usually just save 1/2 aside in a plastic bag, and then I'll start using the other half. So cut it in half this way, and then I'll flip it so that it's cut side down, and I'll start slicing slices this way, and that helps the amount to be a little more manageable, because if you start slicing slices of this giant loaf, you get really big slices really fast. And I think that's it. If you tap on the bread, you notice it's golden brown for the color, and if you tap on it, it should sound kind of hollow. And yeah, it should look cooked on the underside, which is a little tricky here, but if you tap on the underside as well, it should sound hollow. But you'll know. You'll get a feel for this stuff. So yeah, just play around and have fun. I hope you enjoy making your own bread.